So imagine this. Imagine that you didn't know me, but you ran into me at the grocery store, and I said to you something like this: all people identical to me are people who really like your hat. You'd probably think something like, okay, dude's lost his mind. And you'd sort of be right, right? Because in our ordinary day-to-day interactions with one another, we don't speak in standard form categorical statements. In fact, when we encounter arguments where someone is trying to convince us that something is true for particular reasons, they typically don't do that using standard form statements and standard form categorical syllogisms. Instead, we use the kind of language that I'm using now, this kind of informal, ordinary language. And this is kind of a problem for us, right? Because we want to be able to use our knowledge of the principles of categorical logic to evaluate arguments to determine whether they're valid or invalid, whether they're reliable or unreliable. So what we have to do is we have to develop a skill set that allows us to take those ordinary language arguments that we encounter in our daily lives and to translate them into standard form categorical arguments so that we can use our knowledge of the principles of categorical logic to evaluate those arguments. And that's what we're going to focus on here in this thought primer. Now, before we get rolling too far into it, I just want to point something out to you that as you're working on this week's thought primer, or this thought primer, you're going to be translating ordinary language arguments into standard form categorical syllogisms, and you're going to be doing that in part by translating ordinary language statements into standard form categorical statements. And I just want to point out to you that in thought primer number 8, there's a series of lectures that offer you pointers for how to translate particular kinds of statements that lack nouns or noun phrases, or statements that contain the phrase only or the only. And so if you find yourself struggling with translating some of the statements that you're using in your thought primer work, maybe bounce back to thought primer number 8 and see if there's a video lecture that addresses the specific kind of statement that you're trying to translate. As you're working on this week's thought primer, you want to keep in mind that our goal with these ordinary language arguments is to translate them into standard form categorical syllogisms. And that means a couple of things that you want to make sure you're aware of, so maybe take note of this. A standard form categorical syllogism has exactly 3 terms, and each of those terms appears 2 times in the categorical syllogism, and each time it appears exactly the same way. So that might mean that we're going to have to use our operations of conversion, aversion, and contraposition to reduce down the number of terms to 3 and get them appearing exactly the same way. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that a standard form categorical syllogism doesn't just have certain requirements that will apply to its terms, it also has requirements that apply to the statements that make up the categorical syllogism. So you'll remember that the order of the premises matters, right? The major term of the argument, which is the predicate of the conclusion, needs to appear somewhere in the first premise. And the minor term of the argument, which is the subject of the conclusion, needs to appear somewhere in the second premise. So as you're working on translating those ordinary language arguments into standard form categorical syllogisms, you want to make sure that you're not just paying attention to, or you're paying attention not just to the terms of the argument, but you're also paying attention to the form of the argument, the ordering of the premises and the arrangement of the major and minor terms.